Luther Martin was not what you'd expect from a founding figure. He was loud. He was disheveled. He drank too much. And he spoke with the kind of fiery bluntness that left even his allies uncomfortable. But in the chaos of the Constitutional Convention, as the nation's elite quietly built a powerful federal government, Luther Martin did something few dared to do. He stood up and told them they were wrong. Martin was the Attorney General of Maryland, a staunch defender of states' rights, and a brilliant, if erratic, legal mind. He arrived in Philadelphia in 1787 not to build a new government, but to improve the existing Articles of Confederation. What he saw instead was a secret plan to throw out the old system and centralize power under a new constitution. To Martin, this wasn't reform. It was betrayal. From the very beginning, Martin objected to the secrecy of the convention. The public, he said, had a right to know what was being debated behind closed doors. Transparency, to him, was not just a courtesy, but a fundamental requirement of a free republic. Yet even as he voiced his concerns, he found himself drowned out by men more interested in unity than dissent, more eager to write history than listen to it. But Martin refused to be silent. He delivered speech after speech warning that the vague language of federal powers would expand over time, creeping into the daily lives of citizens and eroding the independence of the states. He feared that the newly proposed executive branch resembled monarchy more than republicanism, and he was especially alarmed by the absence of any declared protections for individual rights. No mention of free speech, no safeguard for trial by jury, no barrier against unreasonable searches or cruel punishment. And then there was slavery. Martin was among the few delegates who openly condemned it. He was incensed by the Three-Fifths Compromise and by the implicit protections slavery received in the new Constitution. He called it a stain on the moral conscience of the nation and a dangerous hypocrisy that could undermine everything the Revolution had stood for. This was not a man speaking in measured tones or political calculation. Luther Martin thundered. He insulted. He raged. He described the convention not as a gathering of patriots, but as a cabal of power-hungry elites looking to replace British tyranny with their own. To many in that room, Martin was a nuisance, an obstacle, a distraction from the business of nation-building. But to Martin, principle came before legacy. So in November of 1787, after months of argument and resistance, Luther Martin left the convention and returned to Maryland. There, he gave one of the most important and most forgotten speeches in American history. In a two-day address to the Maryland House of Delegates, Martin exposed what had taken place in Philadelphia. He recounted the secret debates, explained the flaws he saw in the Constitution, and urged his fellow citizens not to ratify it without fundamental changes. It was one of the earliest public critiques of the Constitution, and it laid the groundwork for the anti-federalist movement. Martin's warnings weren't without effect. Thanks to voices like his, the push for a Bill of Rights gained steam. Federalists, once dismissive of such protections, were forced to concede the necessity of enshrining individual liberties to get the Constitution ratified. Though Martin failed to stop the document's adoption, he helped ensure it didn't remain unchecked. But the years that followed were not kind to him. He returned to his role as Maryland's Attorney General, but remained a thorn in the side of federal power. He opposed key Supreme Court rulings that he believed expanded national authority beyond what was originally intended. In one of his most controversial acts, he defended Aaron Burr against charges of treason, insisting that due process applied to all men, even the most hated. He also took part in McCulloch v. Maryland, one of the most consequential constitutional cases in U.S. history. Though the Supreme Court ruled against Maryland, establishing federal supremacy over state law, Martin's arguments echoed with concern that the new national government was growing bolder, broader, and increasingly unmoored from the compact the states had agreed to. Martin's legal legacy was defined not by victories, but by resistance. He became a symbol of pushback in an age of rapid consolidation. Where others sought efficiency through centralization, Martin saw danger, a road that would lead, eventually, to the erosion of liberty in the name of national interest. By the early 1800s, Martin's fortunes had waned. His health declined. His finances crumbled. He was forced to rely on the charity of others, including his old nemesis John Marshall. His mind, once razor-sharp, grew clouded by illness and alcohol. He died in relative obscurity in 1826, the same year as Jefferson and Adams, though with none of their fanfare. Today, Luther Martin is little more than a footnote in American history textbooks. His name is missing from the Constitution, not because he didn't contribute, but because he refused to sign something he believed was dangerous. He wasn't perfect. He could be abrasive, chaotic, even self-destructive. But he also had something rare among political men, a willingness to lose. Luther Martin chose principle over popularity, conscience over conformity. He dared to ask hard questions when others wanted silence. And he paid the price for it. But his legacy endures. Every time we debate the limits of federal power, every time we defend the Bill of Rights, every time someone questions whether we've drifted from the ideals of the Revolution, we echo the voice of Luther Martin. He was a prophet of dissent, a champion of liberty, and a man who understood that freedom is not maintained by agreement, but by resistance. In an age of polished founding fathers, Martin was rough and unvarnished. But maybe that's what made him dangerous. Because the truth, spoken without apology, always is. His story reminds us that the health of a republic does not depend on unity alone, but on the tolerance of dissent, especially when it's uncomfortable. It takes courage to challenge a rising consensus. And it takes clarity to see when liberty is being traded for order. Luther Martin may have walked out of the convention, but he walked straight into the tradition of American resistance, a tradition that must be preserved if the republic is to endure. George Mason was one of the most influential Americans you've probably never heard of. Unlike many of his fellow Virginians, Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Mason never became president, never signed the Constitution, and never sought national fame. But he may have done more than any of them to shape the liberties we now take for granted. Born in 1725 to a wealthy planter family in Fairfax County, Virginia, Mason inherited land, education, and a powerful name. Yet he was no mere aristocrat. Orphaned at age 10, he was raised by an uncle who helped shape his rigorous education in the law, classical literature, and political philosophy. He studied Locke, Montesquieu, and the British common law, and those influences would one day help him redefine the concept of liberty in America. Mason's political rise began not with speeches, but with quiet determination. He shunned the spotlight, preferring his vast personal library at Gunston Hall to the chaos of political life. Yet when the colonies began resisting British authority in the 1760s, Mason's pen proved more powerful than many swords. In 1774, he co-authored the Fairfax Resolves with George Washington, a bold declaration of colonial rights and grievances that foreshadowed the Declaration of Independence. It was Mason's first major public stand, and it revealed his deep suspicion of unchecked government power, whether British or American. 2 years later, in the spring of 1776, Mason would take center stage at the Virginia Convention. While Thomas Jefferson was drafting the Declaration of Independence in Philadelphia, Mason was writing something just as revolutionary in Williamsburg, the Virginia Declaration of Rights. This document didn't merely declare separation from Britain. It outlined, in clear philosophical terms, the inherent and inalienable rights of man, that all men are by nature equally free, that government is instituted for the common benefit, that the people have a right to reform or abolish it when it becomes destructive. It introduced the idea of freedom of the press, trial by jury, and the free exercise of religion. It was the first document in the American colonies to spell out a comprehensive list of individual rights, and it served as a blueprint not just for the U.S. Bill of Rights, but for future democratic revolutions around the world. Jefferson borrowed heavily from it. Madison respected it deeply, but it was Mason who wrote it. Mason also played a major role in drafting Virginia's first constitution and became a mentor and philosophical guide for many younger revolutionaries. Yet, As the American Revolution gave way to the challenges of forming a new national government, Mason's ideals would bring him into conflict with the very men he had inspired. In 1787, Mason was chosen as one of Virginia's delegates to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. At first, he participated actively in the debates, offering proposals and working to improve the emerging framework. But as the summer wore on, he became increasingly alarmed. Mason saw three major problems with the proposed Constitution. First, the lack of a Bill of Rights. He warned that without explicit protections for individual liberties, the new federal government could easily trample on the rights of the people. Second, the power of the presidency. Mason feared that the vague language about executive authority could lead to something dangerously close to monarchy. He called for limits, term restrictions, and checks that others deemed unnecessary. Third, the continued acceptance of slavery. Though a slaveholder himself, Mason opposed the international slave trade and saw its protection in the Constitution as a moral and political failure. As the convention concluded and delegates lined up to sign the final draft, Mason refused. He was one of only three who withheld their signatures. When asked why, he replied bluntly, "I would sooner chop off my right hand than put to the Constitution as it now stands." This decision cost him dearly. Friends like George Washington distanced themselves. Political allies turned cold. Mason's refusal to compromise made him a pariah in some circles, but it also made him a hero to others. He returned to Virginia and became one of the leading voices of the anti-federalist movement. In pamphlets, speeches, and letters, he laid out his objections to the Constitution, warning that the federal government would grow too powerful and too disconnected from the people it claimed to serve. His writings resonated. Across the country, citizens began demanding changes. The Constitution's ratification stalled in several states. Patrick Henry and others invoked Mason's words as they argued for greater protections. Eventually, James Madison, who had initially resisted the idea, agreed to propose a series of amendments once the Constitution was adopted. Those 10 amendments became the Bill of Rights. And in almost every line, you can hear the voice of George Mason. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the right to bear arms, protection from unreasonable searches, due process, the right to a fair trial, protection from cruel and unusual punishment. These weren't federal innovations. They were Mason's legacy. Despite this enormous contribution, Mason faded from public life after 1787. He never ran for national office, never published memoirs, and never sought to rehabilitate his image. He died in 1792, largely unknown to a nation that owed him much. Today, there's no holiday for George Mason, no place on Mount Rushmore. But his influence lives on in the rights we cherish and the protections we often take for granted. His home, Gunston Hall, still stands, a quiet monument to a loud conscience. Mason believed that power, left unchecked, always expands. That liberty, once surrendered, is rarely regained. And that the job of the citizen is not to worship leaders, but to hold them accountable. He warned that even well-intentioned governments can drift toward tyranny if the people become complacent. He refused to sign a flawed document not because he was disloyal, but because he was loyal to something higher, the idea that government must serve the people, not the other way around. George Mason didn't sign the Constitution, but his refusal made it stronger. And in a time when dissent is too often dismissed as disloyalty, his example reminds us that principled resistance is sometimes the most patriotic act of all. Patrick Henry, the founder who feared power more than kings. Most Americans know the name Patrick Henry from one line: "Give me liberty or give me death." It's printed in textbooks, quoted on patriotic holidays, and often remembered as one of the boldest declarations in American history. But that speech, dramatic as it was, tells only part of the story. Patrick Henry wasn't just a passionate orator with a flair for words. He wasn't merely a man of his time. In many ways, he was a man ahead of it. While others were fighting for independence, Henry was already asking what would come next. Would the people stay free after the Revolution, or would they trade one form of tyranny for another? Patrick Henry was born in 1736 in Hanover County, Virginia. He wasn't born into privilege like some of the other founding fathers. His early life was marked by failure. He tried farming and failed. He tried running a business and failed again. But somewhere in those early years, he discovered something that would change his life and eventually the course of American history. He had a gift for speaking. More than that, he had a conviction that ordinary people should not be ruled by distant elites, whether those elites wore crowns or coats. It was through law that Henry found his calling. He taught himself the trade and passed the bar in 1760. In the courtroom, he was electric. He didn't just argue, he connected. He made juries feel, not just think. That same skill translated to politics. In 1765, as a relatively unknown member of the Virginia House of Burgesses, he made a speech that would thrust him into the center of the colonial resistance. The issue was the Stamp Act, a tax imposed by the British Parliament without colonial consent. Henry stood and delivered a warning. He compared King George III to some of history's worst tyrants. The room reacted with horror. Cries of treason echoed through the hall. But Henry didn't flinch. Instead, he responded with one of the most defiant lines of the entire Revolutionary period. "If this be treason, make the most of it." That moment signaled the arrival of a new voice, someone unafraid to call out power, no matter where it came from. Henry wasn't just criticizing Britain. He was putting forth a larger idea, that the people had the moral authority to challenge any government that overstepped its bounds. By 1775, the colonies were nearing open conflict with Britain. The debate wasn't just about taxes anymore. It was about whether the colonies should prepare for war. At the Virginia Convention held in St. John's Church in Richmond, Patrick Henry gave a speech that would define his legacy. He argued that peace was no longer an option. He spoke with urgency, clarity, and a sense of finality. Gentlemen may cry, "Peace, peace," but there is no peace. The war is actually begun. And then, the words that would echo through the centuries, "Give me liberty or give me death." It wasn't just a slogan. Henry wasn't offering a metaphor. He was ready to die. And that authenticity made his words real in a way that few speeches ever achieve. He wasn't trying to inspire the room. He was telling them the truth as he saw it. The time for negotiation was over. The time for resistance had come. The colonies did rise. The war came. And eventually, independence was won. Many of the revolution's leaders went on to craft a new government, build political institutions, and shape the fledgling republic. Patrick Henry could have followed them. He had the reputation, the influence, and the skills. But instead of celebrating victory, Henry grew more anxious. In 1787, as delegates from across the states gathered in Philadelphia to draft a new constitution, Patrick Henry refused to attend. His reason was simple but telling: "I smell a rat." He didn't trust the direction the new government was taking. He feared that the system being designed would create a central authority too powerful, too distant, and too insulated from the people it claimed to represent. He wasn't alone in those concerns, but he was one of the loudest voices. In the Virginia ratifying convention, Henry stood firmly against the Constitution as written. He argued that it lacked sufficient protections for individual liberty. There was no Bill of Rights, no clear limits on the powers of the executive. The federal government could raise taxes, maintain a standing army, and even regulate speech, at least in theory. Henry feared that in their eagerness to form a stronger union, the founders were laying the groundwork for a new form of tyranny. He didn't mince words. He told his fellow Virginians that the Constitution would swallow the states, empower an elite class, and erode the very liberties they had just fought to secure. His arguments were sharp, sometimes repetitive, often emotional, but they resonated with many Americans who were wary of concentrated power. Ultimately, the Constitution was ratified, but not without a fight, and not without changes. The Bill of Rights, 10 amendments that enshrined freedom of speech, religion, assembly, the right to bear arms, and protections against unreasonable search and seizure, was adopted in large part to appease the concerns of men like Patrick Henry. Henry's opposition to the Constitution didn't make him irrelevant. On the contrary, it preserved his role as a vital counterbalance in the early republic. While others celebrated centralization and order, Henry kept sounding the alarm. He believed deeply in the sovereignty of the states and the rights of individuals. He feared that government, by its very nature, seeks to grow, and that without constant vigilance, even a republic could become oppressive. Despite repeated offers, Henry refused some of the most powerful roles in the new government. He turned down appointments as Secretary of State, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and even declined to serve again as Virginia's governor, a position he had already held multiple times. He preferred the independence of private life and the ability to speak his mind without political entanglement. He spent his final years at his plantation, Red Hill, staying involved in legal and political discussions but avoiding the national spotlight. Though less active in the public sphere, he remained a voice of conscience, respected, principled, and uncompromising. Patrick Henry died in 1799. He was 63 years old. That same year, George Washington also passed away. It marked the end of an era, the closing chapter of the Revolutionary generation. But while Washington is remembered for leadership and Jefferson for philosophy, Henry's legacy is different. He was the reminder that freedom is fragile, that revolutions don't guarantee liberty. That power, regardless of who holds it, must always be checked. In the end, Patrick Henry's greatest contribution wasn't just rallying people to fight. It was reminding them why they fought in the first place, and what they stood to lose if they ever stopped questioning those in charge. He understood something timeless, that liberty is not a destination, but a responsibility. He warned us not to become comfortable under any banner, not even our own, because the real threat to freedom doesn't always come from a foreign king. Sometimes it grows from within the very institutions we build to protect it. Patrick Henry remains one of the most important and often overlooked figures of the American founding. His story is not just a historical footnote. It's a warning still worth hearing. In every generation, the people must decide whether to guard their liberty or surrender it piece by piece in the name of safety, unity, or progress. Henry chose liberty at all costs, and that's what made him truly dangerous. Subscribe to Hidden Republic for more untold truths from the lives of America's boldest voices. Because history isn't over, it's just forgotten.